So in this presentation, we're going to take a look at the terrain tools inside Unity. We're going to create a sandbox project, and this is to warm us up to some of the concepts before we get started with our first major project, our island project. Now, this is not intended to be the start of project one. This is, as I mentioned, going to be kind of a sandbox project. We're going to keep this project and use this as kind of a test ground to experiment with concepts and ideas outside of our primary game design project. So I've launched Unity. I'm going to create a new project. And the project that I'm going to create, I'm simply going to call this Sandbox. Now I'm going to reuse this, not Sadbox, that's a different, that's a different game. I'm going to call this Sandbox. And I'm going to save this to the desktop. So I'll click on this ellipse and make sure that I'm pointing to the desktop, and I'll choose. Now the Sandbox is going to be the place where I'll experiment with some, mechanics, objects, terrain, just a place to kind of play throughout the semester. So I'll keep this project as a place where I experiment with new ideas and concepts, and then bring those concepts over to our dedicated project. So I want to make sure that 3D project is selected. We want to avoid the 2D at this point. And just beneath the 2D, 3D project setup, there's an asset packages. And the asset packages, these are packages that Unity provided to give us kind of a quick start towards project creation. And so there's some stuff here that we want to take advantage of. So I'm just clicking on the asset packages. And some of the things that I want to include, I want to grab the characters. I may want to use some of the effects, the environment, and particles. Now it's okay if we miss some of these. I'm going to stick with character, effects, environment, and particles. And I'll say done. If we happen to miss one of those or miss all of them, we can add these to our project after we create it. But this asset packages, we can load these at the time of the project creation. Now we're actually going to grab some additional assets here in a short bit, but you can see I have 4 asset packages that are going to load with this project. So I'll create the project, and I'm going to pause the recording while this is being created. So that took a few minutes for the project to create. It'll take a little bit longer the more assets that you include during project creation. So now what I want to focus on is I want to focus on creating content with the terrain object. So I'm just going to modify my layout here to get it back to the default setup. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Game Objects, and I'm going to create a 3D object, and I'm going to start with a terrain. A terrain is a special kind of object that comes with the terrain component. We'll take a closer look at the terrain component in a minute, but I'm just going to zoom out with my mouse wheel here. And we're going to see that we have quite a big terrain. And when I say a big terrain, it's kind of hard to relate to the size of this because it's just a plane. It could be small, it could be big. I got a sense that it's big because I had to zoom out. Now, in order to get a proper sense of the scale, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another game object. I'm going to create a cube. Now that cube, I'm going to tap the F key to frame. And I'm just going to zoom out a little bit. I'm going to zoom out. Let's see, I'm going to zero out its position. So I could just go to this little cog here and choose to reset. And I'll tap the F key. Try that again, tap the F key, there we go. And that'll frame whatever I have selected. Now if I'm tapping the F key as just kind of a side note, if I select that cube and I tap the F key, it's not going to work until my mouse has focus over the scene view. Okay, so currently that's set to 0, 0, 0. My terrain is also set to 0, 0, 0. It happens to be registered in the corner. That's why things are kind of lining up the way that they are. So I'm just going to pull the mouse back just a little bit, or pull the camera back a little bit. I'm going to take this cube and I'm going to move this over kind of towards the center of the terrain. Now, once I actually start my game project, I'm going to reconfigure my terrain a bit. But again, this is just kind of something to play around with. So I'm going to zoom back in on the cube one more time, and I'm going to move this up so it's sitting above the terrain, and I want to talk a little bit about scale. This cube is a 1 by 1 by 1 cube. Its scale is set to 1. And according to Unity, whenever we see a unit, that unit by default refers to meters, unless we're talking about degrees of rotation, or in some other certain circumstances, most units refer to a meter. So we can think of the scale. When we create this cube, it's roughly 3 meters, or excuse me, it's roughly 1 meter tall. So we can think of that, we can round it to about 3 feet. So if I were to scale this cube along its y-axis, and I just bump that up to 2, if I move this up just a little bit, we can think of this as roughly the height of a person. Okay, it's about 2 meters tall. So if I were to zoom out, that gives me a pretty clear sense of how big the terrain is relative to a person standing in the middle of that terrain. Now, it's large, but not so big that we couldn't move from one side of it to the other in a fairly short amount of time. So this is actually by default a pretty good size for our terrain. Now we'll come back and revisit this cube a little bit later, but I want to focus on the terrain for a moment. So I'm going to select the terrain. And one thing that I want to point out is when we have the terrain selected, if we look over here in the inspector panel, we have a terrain component. And inside that terrain component, we have all these different terrain tools. Now, I'm going to start all the way over at the end and kind of skip around in this list here so we get a pretty clear sense of what we're looking at. If we go all the way over to the end here, we have this little cog, and this is our terrain settings. We can click on the terrain settings, and we can actually kind of scroll down through this if we're not seeing the entire thing. But the thing that I want to point out is our terrain width is currently set to 500, and our length is set to 500. So we're talking about 500 meters square. Okay, so 500 of these cubes stacked end to end would reach the end of this terrain. So that kind of gives us a sense of how large this terrain is. Now I'm going to go back all the way over to the first tool. And when I select on this first tool, we're looking at the raise and lower terrain brush. There's a series of brushes in this component that allows us to sculpt the terrain. Now the first brush, the default brush, is kind of a soft edge brush. And when I roll my mouse over the terrain, you can see that I get this highlight in blue. That highlight represents the brush size and how much of the area we're going to influence based on this brush. So if I bump that all the way up to 100, you can see that's about as big as I can get the brush to go. If I bring that down to a smaller brush, you can barely see it. So I'm gonna, for the sake of the demo, I'm gonna move this all the way up. Now this is the brush size, and if I start to paint, you can see that I'm actually raising the terrain up. Okay, so I'm just kind of clicking and dragging and moving my mouse around, and if I let it just kind of float there, you can see that I can bring this this terrain way up. Now the opacity of the brush, we can kind of think of this as kind of the strength with which the brush is influencing the terrain. So if we want a little more gentle or subtle approach, we can bring that opacity way down, and then as we start to paint, it takes longer for that that terrain to rise up. Okay, so we can use different brushes. We can use these noisier brushes to kind of sculpt up the terrain and add a little bit more detail and texture to it. I'll go back to this soft edge brush for a moment, because if we click and drag around, we're raising the terrain, we're lifting the terrain up and sculpting it. If we hold down the shift key and click and paint, you can see that we push that back down. Now we're pushing it back down to the Y position of the terrain. The Y position is currently set to 0. So when we paint that and push that all the way back down to the ground, that surface is sitting at 0 along the Y. So let me just push this really high mountain that I created back down towards the ground. So we have these basic terrain sculpting tools. I'll just orbit around to get a more dramatic view, a higher contrast view. The next tool over is the paint height tool, and it's very similar to the raise and lower terrain height tool, except that we have a height setting. And so you'll notice that if I drag this slider and if I bump this up to, say, let me just key in a value of, let's say, 30. Now remember, whenever we see units, unless we have a compelling reason to think otherwise, this refers to meters. So we can set the absolute height of this brush to 30. And so it works much like the raise and lower terrain height tools, that as I paint, it'll lift that terrain up, but it tops out at the height. In this case, that's 30 meters high. Okay? And it starts to create this kind of plateau. So if I were to take that and slide that slider down a little bit, so now I'm down to 24 meters and I could paint back over that, you can see that we can use that as a way to control the maximum height of our landscape. And this is going to come in very useful when we start to create our island, because we can kind of set kind of the maximum height of the landscape in certain areas, and that's going to be very useful. Okay, so we have the raise and lower terrain height tool. We have the paint height tool, and the paint height tool allows us to set the height. Now, unlike the raise and lower, there is no shift function here. So I can raise the height up, and it caps out at whatever the height is set to. So if I want to lower it, I just got to set the height of the brush back to whatever I want it to do. Okay. The next tool over is the smooth height. And this, we can kind of think of this as kind of like our iron or our sandpaper, or kind of like a sponge, where if we were to take this and we want to iron or smooth this surface out, we can just paint right over top of it. My opacity is really low, and I'm going to think of that as my strength. So for the sake of the demo, I'm going to bump this way up, take the brush size down a little bit, and I'll just start to paint. And you can see that it quickly kind of smooths out that area. So this, again, we can kind of think of this as our iron if we want to iron out an area. So maybe we start off with the raise and lower terrain height, and we grab one of these real noisy brushes, and we just kind of, that had a really high opacity to it. So I'm going to try to undo and take a step back here. Okay, and if I want to really iron that out, I'll just go back to the raise and lower terrain height, and I'll smash that down with the shift key, and I'll raise that back up again. My opacity is set way too high. Let me just back that off a little bit, and I'll start to raise that back up. So again, if I grab a real noisy brush now, to create a really, really noisy terrain, but I want to go back and I kind of want to keep the terrain details, but I want to smooth it out a little bit, that's when I'll use the smooth height tool. So I'll come back in and just kind of paint over that and kind of soften that up a little bit. Okay, so I can create these really nice kind of sculptured landscapes. All right, now we'll spend more time actually designing our landscape in future presentations, but for now I just want to kind of go over the basic function of some of these tools and some of the assets that we have access to. So the next tool is the paint texture, and this is where things start to get really fun, because with the paint texture tool we can load in textures. So with the paint texture tool selected, I'm going to go down to the Edit Textures button. And when I select the Edit Textures button, I want to add texture. Now, when we hit Add Texture in the top left-hand corner, a window is going to pop up, and this is the Add Terrain Texture dialog box. There's two swatches here. On the left side, there's the Albedo RGB texture and the normal texture. For now, we want to avoid the normal texture and focus on the albedo. And I'm going to hit the select. And from there, this opens up a list to all of the textures that we have access to. Now, some of the textures that it's going to provide to us are actually inappropriate to use with the paint texture. And what I mean by that is if we look at this, there are some textures that kind of show up as like almost this rainbow spectrum. There's some other textures that look like a profile of maybe a branch or a leaf or a flower, or in this case down here we see the profile of some grass. We don't want to use these kinds of textures for our terrain. What we want to do is look at the textures that appear to be kind of more of a top-down seamless texture. We can think of this as kind of like almost like a satellite view, something we would see if we were looking in Google Maps or something similar to that. And this is a top-down seamless texture. So we have this grass hill, we have this grassy rock, and it even says albedo at the end of it. And there's a couple of other options in here by default. I'm going to grab this sand albedo, and I'll just double-click, and you can see that that loads the sand texture in the RGB channel on the left, and I'll just hit Add. Now when I do, that terrain inherits that texture. In addition to that, you can see that over in the texture component of the terrain, you can see that we have that texture highlighted. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another texture. So I'll edit, add texture, I'll go through the same process, and this time around, rather than grabbing the dirt or the sand texture, I'm going to go down and find this grass hill texture. And I'll double click and hit add to load it. Now you can see that now I have two textures. Currently the sand texture is selected, and I can tell because it has this blue highlight underneath it. I'm going to select the green texture, or this grass texture, excuse me. And once I select that, when I roll my mouse over, you can see that I have my brush highlight. I'm going to take the brush size down a bit, take the opacity up a little bit. And once I start to paint, you can see that now I'm painting in that grass texture. Okay. And in this case, the opacity is going to reference how quickly that texture builds up. So if I take that opacity way down, you can see that it takes me a lot longer as I'm painting around to slowly build up to full opacity for that texture. Okay, it's not very opaque. It's kind of transparent right now because its opacity is way down. Okay, now underneath that we have our target strength. The target strength, we can think of this as a transparency as well. If we have our target strength set all the way to 1 and we have our opacity set all the way to 100%, now we're getting an absolute 100% texture when we paint this in. If I drag the target strength back, let's say to about somewhere around 50, and I start to paint, you can see that that's much lighter. It's much more blended. So the maximum strength for this texture is currently 50%. So it's 50% opaque. So we can play back and forth between the strength, the maximum strength of the texture, and the opacity, or how quickly it builds up the opacity of that texture. Okay, so just a slight difference between the two. So just play around with those values to see what you get. So those are the texture tools. Now, there are some textures. If I go to Edit, Add Texture, there's only a few textures that make a lot of sense here. So I'm going to grab the Cliff Albedo texture, and I'll add that. Now I have 3 textures. And you can see I'll come in here and just kind of paint on these cliffs here really quickly. And I'll just do a real rough job. I'll take that opacity down a little bit to be a little bit more gradual about this. But you can see I can get in here and really quickly kind of paint in. Okay, and I'll overpaint in some areas because I can always come back in and grab the grass texture and just kind of like paint back up into. And this is where, you'll want to start to, use a lot of blending and not go to 100%. I'm being very heavy-handed with this so that we can see the results very quickly. And so that you can see this in the demonstration, but you can see that I can really come in here and start blending things and making them look pretty, much better. Okay, so that's kind of a start to the terrain tools. Now, there's a few other tools that I'll just talk about briefly, and that is the Place Trees tool, which is just to the right of the terrain, the paint texture. The Place Trees tool a little bit goes a long way, and we can get really carried away with this. But this is really what the sandbox project's about. It's about giving us an environment where we can really kind of play with some of these settings. Now, this works a lot like the paint texture tool, where we have to edit trees and add trees, but instead of adding a 2-dimensional texture to our terrain, this will actually add 3D models of trees. So I'll go and hit edit trees, and I'll add trees just like I did for textures, but this time the dialog box looks a little bit different, and it's looking for a tree prefab. So what we'll do is we'll click on this little bullet here to the right of this empty game object. I'll just click on this little bullet. And that brings up all of the models that are available inside our project. And for now, there's a few that might be appropriate. I'm just going to scroll down, and there's this Palm desktop. And let me double click and load that and see if this will be one that we want to use. So I've loaded the Palm desktop. You can see that gives me a little model preview here. My brush feels really, really big, so I don't think I want the brush that large. So I'll take it down quite a bit. That seems a little bit more reasonable. And I'll just click around and paint. And you can see that when I start to paint, trees pop up everywhere. Now, as I mentioned, it's really easy to get carried away with the trees. So you kind of want to be careful with these because each one of these represents a 3D model. The more 3D models you have inside your scene, the more taxing it is on your system or your computer to run this. However, we can get away with putting a lot of trees on our terrain. Now, if we put down some trees, and we want to get rid of selective trees, just like the raise lower terrain height, if we hold down the Shift key and paint back over an affected area, it will actually get rid of those trees. Now, it may be that you're zoomed way out. If you zoom out far enough, those trees might disappear and they might not render, and that has to do with the level of detail based on your system resources. So if you're not seeing the trees when you paint, just give it a second, give it a chance to draw. And then zoom in and make sure that you see those. So those are just some, couple of palm trees, and I'll just paint through this and get rid of many of these trees. I'll keep just a few, okay? Now, I do want to point out, I don't want to give a full demo on this tool, but with the Place Trees tool, There are brush settings, and there are these density options, so you'll get fewer trees. You can see I moved my tree density down, and now when I paint, I only get a random tree that pops up every once in a while. And there's some other settings that are quite intuitive, so make sure that you just, pay attention to those and see what some of the options are, and feel free to play around with that. Now, I've made significant progress. I've experimented with most of the tools with the exception of this paint detail brush. But before I use the paint detail brush, I want to save what I'm working on. So I'll do File, Save Scene, and I'll simply call this LVL01. This is the first level of this project, and I'll hit Save. Now when I look down inside my Assets folder, I have a LVL01, and we'll take a look at the final tool inside the Terrain tools here. So the paint detail works very similar to the paint tree tool that we just looked at. If we edit details, we can add two different types of objects. We can add a grass texture, or we can add a detail mesh. Now, if we do add grass texture, this dialog box pops up, and we're going to load a detail texture. And this is the place where we want to use something that looks like a profile. So you can see here that we have these two different grasses here, and it's kind of a profile view or a side view of some grass. And I'll just use this first grass and double click on it. Now, this is often referred to as a billboard style sprite. And by billboard sprite, it just means that it's always registered towards the camera. So you're looking at a side view or a profile. Now, much like the tree texture, I'm just going to paint in. A little bit goes a long way here. So I'll just paint around, and you can see that it actually builds up this grass. Okay, and then when you get real close to it, looks a little silly, but we're not actually going to get that close to it, and it's going to look pretty good when we're walking around on side of our terrain, because it'll simulate and it'll blow in the wind. But just like the Raise Lower Terrain Height tool, and just like the trees, if we hold down the Shift key and paint back, we can kind of clear a path. Okay, so we can get rid of the area that we've affected. Okay, and just like the trees, you'll notice that as I scroll back, that grass disappears, and that's just a level of detail setting, meaning that I'm too far away to actually care about seeing the grass. It's only when I get closer that it starts to draw. Okay, and that's there's a number of reasons for that. It's primarily for efficiency inside the game engine. That's pretty typical inside a game engine to have a level of detail setting. Okay, so we can paint grass. Now, in addition to that, if we edit details, we can add a detail mesh, which is a little bit different. If we paint in grass, we can paint in flowers and other, anything really that's 2D that we want to create in bulk attached to the landscape. Now, the detail, the paint detail, this allows us to paint in things like rocks and other things. Now, I don't see any rocks in here. I was hoping that they had provided a rock, and I don't see one. So we'll take care of that. I'll show you how to download some additional assets from the Unity store here in the next presentation. But for now, let's just play around with the terrain tools and experiment with some of the assets and resources that we have there. In the next presentation, we'll talk about adding water, and then we'll jump into the asset store and find some great free assets provided by Unity and some other developers to really continue to enhance this scene. But we'll catch up in the next presentation.